Daddy. She looks like mommy. The little girl pointed at the bride, stunning the widowed rancher. Snow-muffled Bitter Creek Station, Montana Territory, winter 1883. Until the train's hiss faded and silence pressed like frost on glass, Abigail Thornton stepped down in a faded wedding dress. Suitcase bruised by miles, steam drifted through falling flakes. She scanned the platform for Caleb Monroe, the man who filled 40 letters with sunrise vows and a rancher's promise. No one waved. A freighter shrugged and muttered that Caleb had wed another 2 days past. The words hit like iron. Her veil snagged on a splintered post. She freed it and drew out a linen handkerchief stitched CM blue thread bright against white. A telegraph key clicked somewhere inside, tapping a code she couldn't read. Someone laughed, then hushed. She sat on a cold bench standing hurt, breath feathered. Plans she had sewn by candlelight unspooled across the snow. A wagon rattled through the drift. A little girl under a wool hood stared and whispered, "Daddy. She looks like mommy." The reins slackened. Nathaniel Brooks, widower, reined in and climbed down, as if a wrong move might break something already cracked. His gaze took in the dress, the veil, the stubborn chin, then dropped to the handkerchief. His mouth parted, stunned. That border stitch. Hannah's favorite marked every letter his wife sealed before the fever. How could a stranger carry it here? Wind worried the veil. Abigail lifted her face, expecting pity, meeting recognition. Emma leaned toward her, eyes wide. Abigail reached for courage and found the habit of hope. "Sir," she said, voice steady despite the shake. "Is there a telegraph I can use?" Nathaniel swallowed. "There is," he answered, "but I reckon there's something you ought to see first. What if the promise that broke her wasn't the whole story, and the truth bound her to a past she never lived?" Snow at Bitter Creek Station lay in ridges from wagon wheels and boots. A pale crust that squeaked under every step. Abigail Thornton stood with her scuffed suitcase, the faded wedding dress she had sewn by candlelight hidden beneath a brown shawl. In Richmond she had turned collars, stitched hems, and pieced beauty from leftovers after the lamps went dark, guiding her needle by a smoking stub of tallow and a steady hum that kept worry quiet. She had read 40 letters until the paper softened, each line promising hearth, sky, and a place at a table where someone waited for her laughter. Belief had carried her west. Now the train's last hiss thinned in the icy air, and no familiar hat tilted in greeting. A freighter shifting a crate muttered that Caleb had married 2 days before. The sentence struck like a hammer, precise and heavy. Her handkerchief, stitched with CM in careful blue, looked foolish in her palm. The telegraph office creaked. Coal smoke salted the snow. The platform's loose plank clapped and fell. She sat because standing felt like pride she could not afford, and watched breath feather while plans unspooled like thread pulled too hard. A wagon drew up. A little girl under a wool hood stared and whispered, "Daddy, she looks like mommy." The team halted as if the words themselves were reins. The driver stepped down with the wary care of a man familiar with law. He wore a salt-marked coat and well-used gloves. Grief, not cruelty, had carved his face. "Ma'am," he said, voice kept low by cold. "Station agent's inside. The stove isn't much. I can fetch him if you need a message sent." Courtesy steadied her better than comfort. She rose, gathered her shawl and nodded. "Thank you. I should send one." Her mouth closed on the name that had meant home yesterday. "Brooks," he said. "Nathaniel, this is Emma. This is Emma. This is Emma. This is Emma." The child waved a mitten, curiosity bright. "We're bound north of town. If you've nowhere warm, thaw a while before choosing your road. People choose badly when they cannot feel their hands." Duty framed the offer. Kindness warmed it. Abigail counted her coins, the hours until dark, and the cost of pride. "You are good," she said. "I do not wish to burden your household." "Trouble would be leaving you here," he answered. "Storm will slide off the ridges by evening." He unbuttoned his coat and set the rough wool across her shoulders. Heat moved into places that hurt. She breathed hoarse pine pitch and clean iron. Emma leaned forward, studying the beaded neckline that caught light whenever Abigail moved. "Are you a princess?" the girl asked. "Not a princess," Abigail said, meeting her eyes. "A seamstress. I sew for others and sometimes for myself when the thread is left." The station felt desolate beyond the weather. Snow clogged the cut between rails, Inside, the key snapped messages with tireless indifference. Her mind traveled to the Richmond shop. Fogged windows, stiff aprons, wages counted 1 coin at a time on a chipped plate. She had saved after rent and bread, trusting that frugal days would buy a warmer life. She had pictured a porch facing west, cattle at a fence line, a kitchen scented with coffee and wood smoke, and a man who meant his word. She had trusted a hand she had never held. Nathaniel guided her toward the office. The operator glanced up, softened for Emma, and pushed a pencil across the counter. Heat pressed from the stove without reaching the corners. Abigail counted words and wrote to Lowry for a reference, then to a cousin in Charlottesville who might know of work. The messages cost more than she liked, yet less than waiting in the cold while regret grew teeth. She signed in a careful script. Nathaniel paid for coal without comment. Emma watched the brass lever as if it controlled thunder. Outside again, the wind sharpened. Without touching more than her elbow, Nathaniel helped Abigail to the wagon seat. She set the suitcase between her boots and kept her gaze ahead. "My place isn't grand," he said, taking the reins. "Sound roof, warm kitchen most days if the wood holds. You can rest, then I'll see you to the boarding house or a neighbor. A little warmth will help me think," she answered. Emma wriggled close and slid small hands under Abigail's shawl with the easy trust of a child who knows she is safe. "I'm 4, the girl announced. "Our dog is Tansy. She steals mittens." Abigail found a smile. "I can mend mittens," she said. "I am good with difficult scenes." The wagon jolted forward. The station settled behind them like a squat shape under white. Tracks ran straight until the land rose. Spruce gathered in black stands along the draws. Emma spoke in short bursts about sled ruts, the pump that froze and the bell by their door. Abigail asked gentle questions about favorite stories and the color of Tansy's ears. Nathaniel held quiet until the road curved. "Hannah baked on storm days," he said at last. "She said the smell kept snow out of the bones." The sentence did not ask for sympathy. It opened a small door and left it so. Abigail kept her reply simple. "My mother boiled orange peel with sugar when fever came through our lane," she said. "We could not spare much, but the scent felt like courage." She did not name the graves or the year cholera took half the block. She offered brightness because sorrow already filled the wagon. They crossed a creek that shone like glass at the edges. A split rail fence appeared, then a barn roof with white sliding and slow sheets. Smoke from a chimney rode a wavering line that the wind kept trying to erase. The house sat plain against the slope. Clapboards weathered gray. Porch swept. Latch polished by hands. A bell hung by the steps, still as a moon. Abigail pressed gloved fingers to the borrowed coat and let the jolt of the lane settle through her bones. She did not know where she would sleep next week, or what work would hold through winter besides mending and any task a back like hers could lift. She did not know whether sorrow would harden or break her. She knew only that staying a few hours made sense until she could choose with a clear head. She looked at the child leaning into her with trust as natural as breath, and felt an ache that carried no man's name, only a yearning for rooms where voices wanted her to enter. Need and weather had laid a short road to this doorway. She would walk it without apology. The team quickened through a drift. The runners scraped. Nathaniel steadied the wagon with a light hand. Attention fixed and quiet. Emma's gaze clung to Abigail's face, as if she could keep the newcomer from vanishing when shadows changed. The ranch drew near. The world narrowed to the hush of snow, the creak of leather and a child's unblinking attention while they headed toward the house waiting now on the rise, and the life none of them had planned. The guest room held a narrow bed, a patchwork quilt, and a small window traced with fern-like frost. Abigail set her suitcase on the trunk and watched her breath bloom, then fade. The house felt modest and careful, as if every board had been chosen for endurance rather than show. From the hall came the thump of boots and the light patter of a child's steps. Emma peeked around the doorframe, eyes wide beneath a hood she had refused to remove until warmth convinced her. Abigail smiled and lifted a hand in greeting, the shawl slipping from one shoulder before she tugged it back into place. Her dress, folded inside the case, held the glow of remembered effort. Each bead a small night star, each seam a promise she had stitched for herself when no one else would. "Is your dress heavy?" Emma asked. "A little," Abigail said. It carries hours. Did you make it? I did, Abigail answered, keeping her voice even. By candlelight when the shop was quiet. Emma studied her hands. Do needles bite? Only when they forget their manners, Abigail said, and the child laughed, head tipping like a bird listening for seed. A floorboard creaked. Nathaniel paused in the doorway, hatless as if measuring the wind through the window that was shut. He nodded, almost a greeting, almost a check for trouble. His gaze went first to Emma, then to the corners, then to Abigail's hands. He carried weariness like a loaded pail. Guest room's yours, he said. Water's warming, we eat early. Thank you, she replied. He stepped away. Emma stayed, earnest as snowfall. My scarf tore, she confided. Tansy chased me, and it snagged a nail. She produced a length of yellow wool with a jag along one edge. I can fix that, Abigail said. She opened a inside, wrapped in muslin, lay a tin of dried herbs, a bone-handled needle case, and small hoards of thread saved from careful wages. She chose a spool near the scarf's shade, threaded the needle, and sat by the window, where pale light gathered despite the ice. Why that color? Emma said, balancing on one foot, then the other. Because mending prefers not to be seen, Abigail answered. Emma grinned. Abigail eased tension with anchoring stitches, and crossed the tier with a tidy ladder. Her humming rose when the wool resisted, then softened as it yielded. Emma watched the needle dip and rise. When the mend disappeared, Emma sighed the way someone does when covers settle just right. Can I wear it now? As soon as I tie off. Abigail bit the thread and smoothed the seam. Emma looped the scarf, declared it brave, and darted toward the kitchen. Left alone, Abigail rubbed the glass to clear a circle. Snow drifted down, erasing tracks as fast as boots could plant them. The barn stood blunt against a heave of white. A juniper bowed, its green smothered under ice. Outside looked hushed and distant, as if words would echo too loudly. Inside felt like a held breath. She carried the kettle to the pump and filled it, listening to the gruff duet of leather and wood as Nathaniel brought in split sticks. He set them by the hearth. Attention on flame, attention away from her. When she thanked him, he nodded. He crouched, coaxing ember to life, moving with competence born from repetition, the sort that keeps hunger from getting idea. Emma hopped in with flour, dusting her mitten from a bold swipe at a board where a crock of dough waited. We bake on storm days, Emma said. That sounds wise. Abigail said. Mama did. The child added, then stopped, as if stepping near a thin place on a frozen creek. Abigail touched the scarf's end. Your mama liked warm things, she said. Emma nodded, reassured by a fact that could be held without cutting skin. Nathaniel stood, brushed ash from his hands, reached for a cup, and remained at the edge. He did not intrude, yet nothing inside the room escaped his notice. Outside, flakes thickened to a quiet curtain that narrowed the world to porch, yard and a bent post where sparrows huddled. Inside, the stove ticked, and the clock above the mantel counted without hurry. Abigail lifted the herb tin near the heat so the scents could wake. Steam rose from the kettle. She pinched thyme, broke a bay leaf, crumbled sage, and added a curl of dried orange peel saved from a kind vendor. The air tilted toward brightness. Emma sniffed. It smells like a story. A good story needs patience and a simmer, Abigail answered. She sliced an onion with careful economy and browned it in bacon fat left from breakfast. She added water, and a handful of barley after asking where it lived and saying please. Nathaniel set a sack on the table without speaking, but the corner of his mouth acknowledged courtesy, then forgot it. Have you ever felt like a stranger in someone's world? Abigail's kindness is starting to change that. Keep reading to see how. She tasted and adjusted, then began biscuits, cutting lard into flour until the bowl held drifts that looked like weather. Emma climbed onto a chair and pressed a tin cup into the dough to make rounds. Her small fingerprints left half moons along the edge. Abigail brushed the tops with milk and slid the pan into the oven. The house seemed to breathe. The hallway lost a bit of its draft. Even the clock sounded companionable. While the soup thickened, Abigail carried her needle to the sitting room, and examined a frayed cuff on a work shirt. She set 2 rows of tiny stitches that would outlast spring. Nathaniel lingered in the doorway, arms crossed. Gaze on the window where snow rearranged shapes. He stayed long enough to see the cuff squared, then turned away when she looked up. He was moved and not read. Emma fetched a book with a broken spine and asked for a story. Abigail read simple sentences about a fox in a storm who found shelter under a fallen tree. She matched the rhythm with small attention. Emma drifted toward sleep, resisting with comic determination. The kettle rattled. Abigail rose, lifted the lid and stirred. Steam carried the garden she had brought in paper twists. She ladled a taste into a cup and offered it to Nathaniel without forcing his hand to hers. He took it, sipped and nodded once. Approval lived there, brief and on. By dark, soup deepened, and biscuits browned. Abigail set the table with steady movements that disguised the tremor still living under her ribs. Nathaniel bowed his head for a breath. Thanks outlasted easy faith. They ate without her. Emma narrated, crumb by crumb, the adventure of rescuing a mitten from Tansey's heroic theft. Nathaniel listened with that durable softness he reserved for the child. Abigail answered questions about the thread, the city and trains that pant like dogs when they climb. Her answers were small and true. When the plates emptied, Abigail washed, Emma dried, and Nathaniel stacked wood. Work put each of them where they knew how to stand. Later, Abigail folded the repaired scarf at the foot of the bed for the morning. She opened the window a finger's width to let warmth slip out and a straight line of cold slip in. She slid her dress beneath the quilt to spare the beating. Through the gap flakes wandered down. The lane would vanish by dawn. She lay back and listened to the house settle. Nathaniel's step paused once outside her door, then moved on. He noticed. He kept his distance. Sleep came like a truce. Before dawn, the wind worried the eaves. Abigail woke and lit a lamp. She warmed her hands around its small light and dressed for a morning that would not wait for doubt. In the kitchen she stoked the coals, set water on and whisked cornmeal with a pinch of salt for mush. She slipped a scrap of paper under the herb tin, listing what remained, as if discipline could steady fortune. Nathaniel entered, hair damp from the pump, and stopped at the threshold. Surprise passed through his face, then retreated behind habit. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she returned. He glanced at the shelf where the order had appeared overnight. His eyes acknowledged the change without granting permission. He poured coffee and stood by the window, watching the yard blur into one pale field. Emma arrived, trailing a quilt, and asked for a song while the mush thickened. Abigail hummed the tune from the guest room, a ribbon barely above breath. The child's shoulders loose. Nathaniel drank, cup steady, gaze elsewhere. Abigail served bowls and set honey within reach. They steamed their faces. Emma ate earnestly, sticky and pleased. Nathaniel finished, thanked her with a short word, and pulled on his coat. He harnessed the team while Abigail cleared dishes. Through the walls came the agreeable clank of trace and buckle. She wiped crumbs, folded the cloth, and set her needle case where she could find it again without thinking. When the door opened, snow rode in on his boots and left wet commas across the floor. He paused, weighed a remark, discarded it and said only, "I'll be in the barn." She nodded. Emma slipped her hand into Abigail's and tugged toward the window. "Can we make paper flowers?" Later, Abigail said, after chore. They bundled and fed the hens, their boots squeaking. Sky and earth met without seam. Abigail showed Emma how to scatter grain so greedy birds would not peck her fingers. On the way back the child looked up with fierce hope. "Will you still be here tonight?" "Tonight," Abigail said, not promising more. Emma accepted the measure and smiled as if the word itself were a lamp. Abigail felt the house gathering her into its plain rooms. Nathaniel crossed the yard with hay on his sleeve, slowed and watched from the snow. He kept his distance. Morning settled into shape as predictably as the line of posts vanishing into white. Abigail rose with the stove, slipped on boots, and stepped into a rhythm that asked for hands more than questions. She fed hens, shook crumbs from cloths, and brought in kindling stacked last summer. After breakfast, she spread Nathaniel's ledgers across the table beside a blunt pencil and ink. Receipts curled beneath a sugar bowl, columns stumbled. She straightened the stack and copied sums into tidy rails, correcting an error without scolding it. Emma colored with a blue chalk stub on paper from a crate label. "Can I draw our ranch?" the child asked. "You can," Abigail said, sketching a rectangle for the barn and a square for the house. "Add a door or the wind will live inside." Emma grinned and drew carefully, tongue pressed against one cheek. Outside, snow deepened and carried the world farther from town. Only the plod of hooves and Tansy's quick bark moved the hush. Oats, lamp oil and salt lined Abigail's columns and told their own weather. Before dinner she read to Emma from the Fox book, marking pages when bread needed tending. Emma pulled a chair close to the stove and leaned into Abigail's side, the top of her head warm beneath Abigail's palm. "Your dress is pretty like stars," Emma said, touching a bead with reverent caution. "It took many nights," Abigail answered. "How many?" "More than I could count without losing track." The child climbed into her lap as if it were a sled that never The house listened. Even the clock quieted. Nathaniel came in with a drift riding his shoulders and paused. Emma tucked against Abigail, lamplight glancing off beadwork like ice catching sun. His face changed, then guarded itself. He stamped snow from his boots. "Storm's thickening," "Cattle will hold to the draw, will they be safe?" Emma asked. "They know where the hill breaks the wind." He poured coffee, watched Abigail's finger travel the lines and the ridge in his brow softened. "Chores are wrapped every hour." Abigail kneaded dough, then divided tasks in the ledger margins. Deliveries due, fence to mend, feed counts marked with triangles. She filed receipts in a box cut from a cigar crate, labeled with twine and ribbon saved in Virginia. Nathaniel glanced over the bundles, touched a corner as if to confirm it existed, and cleared his throat. "I used to keep better," he said. Hannah liked order. "It happens," Abigail said. "We can begin again." He nodded and set a small cloth packet on the table. "She kept seed," he said. "Wildflower from down the creek. Color helps the eye remember sweetness when winter eats the rest." "Purple ones," Emma said. "Purple, yellow and little white bells," Nathaniel answered, almost smiling. She tucked them in fence corners. Bees argued about who loved them most. The story settled like a shawl. Afternoons drew long. The window turned to a pale mirror with frost along its edge. Abigail mended a blanket, set a new patch on a cuff, and hummed a lullaby that lived in her hand. Emma arranged wooden spools into a procession and named each one after a bird. Sometimes Nathaniel's shadow crossed the threshold and retreated. A pattern of nearness that hurt less than it should. Yet guilt rode her like a second cloak. When steam fogged the glass, she touched the pocket where Caleb's last letters slept, creased by miles. She had imagined a porch, a hearth, and a word that stood steady through weather. She had poured all her savings into that hope and watched it sink while standing on a platform that smelled of smoke and iron. Shame stung without asking if it was owed. During a heavy afternoon when the wind ran a finger along the eaves, Abigail brewed tea with orange peel. She set a cup near the ledger and lifted the beaded dress from its folded bed to let the skirt breathe. Emma approached, breath-catching. "Tell it a story." "Once," Abigail said, "this dress lived in a box. It dreamed of music. It learned patience instead." Emma nodded, then climbed again into Abigail's lap, pressing a hand against the skirt as though the fabric were some gentle animal. "Pretty like stars," the child whispered, softer now. Nathaniel leaned against the doorjamb and finished the wildflower story. Hannah watering seedlings with a tin scoop, laughing when a calf mouthed petals, pinning a sprig in his hat, and calling him handsome until he blamed the sky for the red in his face. He spoke with a voice sanded by weather and time. When he stopped, his gaze held the floor and the yard. Night pulled close. Abigail closed the ledger and weighed the papers. She washed plates, dried them with a rag and lined the cups by size. Emma slept in a spill of quilt on the settee. Nathaniel carried the child to bed with a care that respected dreams. The house found a center and rested there. Abigail returned to her room. She sat on the trunk and drew Caleb's letter from the pocket where it had worn a home. The creases mapped a country she no longer trusted. She read again as if a sentence might change when air shifted. Boards weathered by sun, coffee waiting. A corral mended by 2 pairs of hands. They asked her to believe. She pressed the page to her chest until the ache loosened, then rose to slip the dress into its wrap. The dress felt heavier than the fabric alone. Something crackled inside the lining where her needle had doubled cloth to strengthen the waist. Abigail set the lamp closer and found a loose thread along the inner seam. A scrap of paper peered from a narrow channel she must have stitched shut months ago. She eased it free and unfolded a small note thinned by handling. The hand was Caleb's, yet the tone tilted. A hurried line about delays. A mention of pressure. A hint that someone had pushed him toward a choice he did not name. Forgive the silence. It read. There are matters here I cannot set to ink. I will explain when you arrive. Trust me if you can. The room shifted. Not from standing too fast, but from a past that moved underfoot. Had he meant betrayal, or had the crowded station delivered only half a truth? She accepted because hurt loves a straight road. She sat on the bed, the note trembling between finger and thumb. Outside, wind combed drifts into higher walls. The house creaked as timber answered cold. The clock counted the same seconds as before, yet each felt altered. Abigail read the words again and again, then pressed both pages to her heart. One warm with longing, one thin with warning. She did not forgive. Confusion edged the pain and opened a small space where breath could live. She slipped the note back into the lining to keep it from Emma's curious hands and from her own habit of staring until letters blurred. She knotted the seam with 3 stitches only a careful eye would find. Down the hall. A board spoke under Nathaniel's step. He paused near her door, as if the weather inside the room had changed and he could sense it without seeing. Abigail did not call out. He moved up. Snow pressed against the panes. She lay back, dress safe. Letters hidden, and watched lamplight thin to a single coin before darkness took the edge from everything. 2 truths stood near each other without touching. Hannah's wildflowers sleeping under snow, and a promise in a stranger's hand that might not be broken in the way she had believed. Morning would bring ledgers and chores. Emma would ask for another page. Nathaniel would measure distance with care. Tonight the house held them while the storm built the walls that kept them together. Still the note's warning unsettled her, rekindling difficult questions inside. Evening pulled a gray shawl over the house just as Emma's chatter thinned to a whisper. She pressed the back of her hand to her cheek, frowned, and murmured that she felt too warm. Abigail touched the small brow and found heat rising like a kettle left too long on the iron. That glassy brightness lit the child's eyes, the kind that frightens even steady hearts. Nathaniel set down the log he carried and crossed the room in 2 quick strides. He reached, hesitated, and let Abigail keep her palm where it steadied the moment. Fever, she said softly. His jaw tightened, though his voice stayed even. Tell me what you need. Abigail drew water and laid folded cloths along the sill so the night air could cool them. She coaxed Emma to drink, counting slow swallows as if each one paid down a debt. A cough rattled twice, then settled into shallow breaths. Abigail lifted her and set her in the largest bed, layering blankets light enough to breathe through. Nathaniel stood at the footboard with his hat in one hand, though he had not meant to wear it. Silence hung from his shoulders like a yoke. When Abigail asked for willow bark for tea, he fetched the tin without a word, measured a careful pinch, and set the kettle above the smallest flame. By midnight the heat climbed. Emma shivered, then burned. Abigail sponged delicate wrists, the temples where a pulse fluttered like a trapped moth, and the crook of each elbow where warmth gathers first. She hummed until her breath matched the rhythm, then began the lullaby Emma had called Mama's song, pieced together from the child's halting memory over the last weeks. The melody softened the corners and pushed back the draft. Nathaniel's shoulders eased despite himself, only to stiffen when memory rose like ice in a well. He stood watch at the doorway, a figure cut from worry and winter. Emma woke, and asked if snow could swallow sound. Abigail turned the pillow, changed the cloth, and brushed damp hair from the hot forehead. Not ours, she said. Our voices carry. Nathaniel paced to the threshold and back, measuring the room the way a rider tests a frozen ford. I can try for Doc Avery, he said, though the road outside was a pale field without edges. Abigail weighed distance against hours. If dawn comes kinder, go, she answered. Tonight she needs water and a watch. He nodded, half grateful for instruction, half ashamed to be grateful. Hours peeled away. The lamp coughed, recovered, and burned steadily. Abigail measured fever by touch and instinct. She wet cracked lips with a honey spoon, lifted the child when chills took hold, then laid her flat so heat could spill. Nathaniel kept the kettle talking, brought fresh towels and fed the fire with hands that had lifted beams and calves and grief. When he asked if another cloth would help, his voice sounded strained. He would not rest until something shifted, and he did not know which way it would go. Near dawn, Emma's breathing turned fast and thin. Panic beat its wings against the walls. Abigail gathered her close and rocked with a steadiness that said, "You are safe," even when the room shook. The lullaby changed shape in her throat, slower and warmer, wrapped around Emma's name until fear had fewer places to grip. "Mama used to sing that," the child rasped. "I know," Abigail whispered. "You taught me the tune." Nathaniel braced one hand against the doorframe to keep from reaching toward what he feared to lose. Another winter night rose like a ghost. Hannah's skin hot as the stove, the desperate hush between breaths. He swallowed the old terror and stayed where Abigail's calm could hold the room. Day crawled in despite the storm. The window held a thin blue that made every edge look brittle. Abigail refreshed the basin, wrung a cloth and drew it across the burning brow. She whispered ordinary comforts. "There will be biscuits soon. The fox in your book will find the hollow. Tansy will behave for at least 10 minutes. Emma smiled at nothing, then drifted. Lashes stuck together, chest rising in inconsistent waves. When the fever eased for a breath, Abigail drew air deep enough to reach the part of her that had rattled loose on the platform and set it back where it belonged. Nathaniel ground coffee that he did not drink. He spoke about sleigh paths he would cut if the wind dropped, about the spring where the creek begins, about a fence line that would hold if he found the right posts. He could not say he was scared. Fear had ruled in a man who buried his wife. He could only say woodpile, gate, beam and hope someone heard the words he could not voice. Abigail heard him anyway and answered by wringing another cloth and laying it gently as a promise. The sun climbed a finger's breadth beyond the ridge. Fever returned with the stubbornness of something that believes it owns the room. Abigail mixed vinegar with water and reset the compress. She sang again, the song smaller now, a thread through the needle eye of worry. She steadied her voice on hush. The room obeyed. Nathaniel knelt and warmed Emma's feet between his hands, bone and muscle tender where strength usually lives. He did not meet Abigail's eyes. Thanks would break him. By the second night, weariness pressed behind Abigail's lids like she refused the chair Nathaniel pushed toward her, and kept the bed's edge, one hand on the child's shoulder, the other on the bowl. When Emma's cough shook, Abigail lifted and held until the rattle eased. She told a story about a winter kitchen and paper flowers that outlast snow. She made the flowers red and yellow because dreams need color when the windows frost. Nathaniel stood in the doorway as if taking an oath he could not yet speak aloud. Tansy curled under the bed and sighed, as if even the dog had chosen vigil. A gust banged the shutter. Emma startled and reached blindly. Abigail caught the seeking hand and pressed a cool cloth across the brow until the small fingers loosened. Then she said the words that belonged to the hour. "Can you feel the weight of a child's trust? Abigail's care is binding them." Read on to see if it lasts. Outside, the storm heaped the yard into ridges that erased paths and turned fences into broken lines. Nathaniel saddled a horse, made it as far as the gate, and turned back because distance would finish what fear began. In the barn he stood breathing steam and called himself a coward, then understood it was love that kept him here. He returned with new wood and a towel warmed at the stove, then took his old place at the edge, near enough to answer any need, far enough not to intrude on the only work that mattered. Night thinned again toward morning. Emma's skin blazed, then cooled, then blazed. Abigail kept time with the rise and fall, changed clothes, counted breaths, and never let the lullaby vanish. Nathaniel's hands shook once when he filled the basin. He hid the tremor by lifting another log. He had survived loss by building walls inside his rib. The song threaded those boards and made them less sure. Near midnight of the second day, the heat at Emma's temples cooled a shade. The flush faded from her cheeks, leaving a pale map where color had burned through night and day. Her breath stretched, small chest rising in steady measure like a spring creek finding its bed. Abigail waited through 100 even counts before letting belief in. When it arrived, she did not cheer. She smoothed the quilt, adjusted the pillow and went on being careful because recovery is shy and startles when you name it. Emma slept hard, mouth slightly open, lashes dry. Abigail's head tipped toward the headboard. She meant to hum another line and then consider the herbs she had used. What remained? What to cut by half? Sleep caught her mid-breath. Her hand rested just above the child's shoulder, ready even in surrender. The lamp burned low. A tiny sun in a country made of drift and a page of the Fox book lay face down on the table, as if the animal too were resting in its hollow. Nathaniel stood in the doorway and watched them, The woman who had held fear without dropping it and the child who trusted without counting the cost. Something stirred under the weight he had worn for 2 years. Something like thaw beneath crusted snow. He let it come anyway. Let it warm the place he had kept quiet for safety's sake. Hope felt like stepping onto ice in half-light. Dangerous. Necessary. Unavoidable. He did not move close. He did not speak. He kept his post and watched the breath of his daughter slow into comfort and the breath of the seamstress lengthen into earned sleep. And he understood that what bound them now had been stitched by ordinary hands. One cool cloth. One song. 1 hour at a time. Afraid to hope, he hoped anyway, and the house, listening, seemed to breathe with him. Snow eased, but didn't quit when a hard knock thudded against the door. Abigail rose from Emma's bedside, checked the child's breath, and stepped into the hall. Nathaniel was in the barn repairing a trace. The house held the hush of recovery, and the clock's slow tick. She opened to winter and a face she had once stitched hope toward. Caleb Monroe stood on the porch, hat crushed in both hands, coat filmed with trail dust, beard shadowing a thinner jaw. His eyes looked rimmed by sleepless miles and a kind of need that eats its host. "Abigail," he said, voice rough. "I made a mistake." She stood inside Nathaniel's borrowed coat and kept the door open just enough for air. Not to claim behind her lay warmth that smelled of sage and wood smoke. "You married," she said. "The station told me before you did." "I was cornered," he answered, words tumbling. "A banker with his hands on my notes. A cousin with a dowry dangled like a rope. If I didn't take it, I'd lose herd and land. I never meant to set you in the snow. Come now, and I'll undo the wrong. I'll speak to a judge. We can leave and begin again." She let the wind sting her cheek rather than step aside. "You wrote 40 letters," she said. "You built a life in ink and let a freighter break it with 1 sentence." Caleb flinched, then pressed harder. "A gun rode my back that afternoon," he said. "Not drawn, but there. I was watched. If I'd run to you, I'd have ruined us both. I rode the long way because I heard you came and couldn't breathe until I saw you safe. Abby, forgive me. Come away. What you call a corner looks like convenience when a man wants 2 outcomes," she said. "You kept your land and threw my plans into the drift." He leaned closer, pleading, turning into leverage. "If you won't come, I'll speak frankly to that widower. I'll tell him how you lived, stitching through Sundays, tossed from a boarding house when coin ran short. I'll make him see you as desperate and he'll turn you out before supper. Think of Emma. I'd rather protect you, but I'll protect myself if I must." Heat flared clean and steady. "You'll weaponize hunger?" she asked. "I sewed to live. I sewed a dress to honor a promise. Work isn't shame." Bootsteps crunched in the yard. Nathaniel reached the steps with a coil of leather and stopped. Snow salted his hair at the temples. He took in their nearness. The angle of Abigail's shoulders, the hungry tilt of Caleb's mouth, and did not move. Caleb turned his head, voice smooth. "Evening," he said. "I've come to apologize and take Miss Thornton where she promised to go. I promised a man who vanished." Abigail said. Nathaniel's voice was careful. "This is your Caleb." "A man by that name," she answered. Caleb spread empty hands. "We were engaged by the written word," he told Nathaniel. "Circumstances forced me elsewhere. I'm here to repair it. If she rides now, I can settle things. If not, I'll speak plainly about her past. Town ears are swift." Abigail stood taller. "My past is honest labor," she said. "He hopes you'll treat it as a stain." Nathaniel's gaze moved between them, catching only fragments. "Engaged. Rides now, past." And a private tone he hadn't been invited to hear. He missed the threat because shame prefers a quiet voice. He missed Abigail's steadiness, because fear makes any secret feel sharp. Caleb sighed in pity. "She didn't tell you?" he asked. "Not even after nights by your child's bed?" "Do not trade on Emma's fever," Abigail snapped. The name in Caleb's mouth made Nathaniel's jaw hard. He set the coil on the rail with the slow care used when something fragile has already cracked. "You could have told me," he said to Abigail quietly. "You could have said his name." "I was trying to learn whether truth held," she answered. "I found a note hidden in my dress. His hand, written before I left, saying he was under pressure and would explain. I needed to weigh it before setting grief in your rooms." Caleb's eyes brightened. "A note she keeps against her skin," he told Nathaniel, sweet with triumph. You see how it is? You hid that scrap by happenstance when I reinforced a seam, Abigail said. You never meant to confess until cost found you. Wind pushed a gust across the porch. The hall lamp flickered. Nathaniel looked toward the dark where Emma rested, then back at the doorway history had shouldered open. He measured the space between gratitude and caution and chose the older road. Retreat is easier than trust when winter has already shown what it can take. This house isn't for quarrels, he said. I won't hold you where you don't wish to be. Do what your promises demand and leave me to mine. Nathaniel, Abigail said, reaching a hand he didn't see. Please, listen. He stepped off the porch, boots carving crescents into drift. Posture straight, pace steady. He didn't slam the gate. The set of his shoulders did it for him. His back looked like judgment. To Abigail it looked like a hurt choice of armor. Caleb released a small breath and leaned in. You see? Silence breeds doubt. Pack your case. We'll be gone before tongues wake. Abigail closed the door partway so the house wouldn't have to swallow the rest. I'm not free, she told him. I decide where I go and when. I won't be bullied by gossip. You'll decide against cold, he said, patience returning like a salesman's smile. That man won't forgive secrecy. Widowers learn hard math. She held his gaze until his slid away. Leave my porch, Caleb, she said. Tomorrow I'll speak to the pastor and the judge, and tell what needs telling. Tonight this house belongs to rest. He withdrew a pace, then another, reading the line of her mouth in the straightness of her stance. Habit, older than love, made him touch his hat. He turned into snow that erased prints as he made them and vanished toward town. Abigail stood in quiet and felt the room tilt, as if the floor were a raft cut loose on a thaw. She pressed her palm to the jamb until the world steadied. The ranch she had begun to help carry seemed to slip, not because she had failed, but because trust can break without raising its voice. She thought of Emma's weight against her during fever, of ledgers brought into order, of the seed packet waiting for spring. The future she had started shaping felt suddenly distant. She breathed once, twice, and slid the latch. Snow hissed against the panes. Somewhere in the dark Nathaniel's boots crossed the yard, then the barn threshold, then the space a man uses when he needs walls more than company. The distance felt longer than the lane. She leaned her forehead against the wood and let the ache move through, not around. Morning would demand daylight word. Tonight she could only keep watch over the fragile quiet, and admit what the wind already knew. The place she wanted was slipping from her grasp. Dawn seeped across the ranch house as if light were unsure. It belonged there. Abigail woke before the stove ticked and sat upright in the guest room where frost wrote ferns along the window. She lifted her suitcase onto the trunk, the lid creaking like a confession, then folded two blouses, a worn skirt, wool stockings and a shawl that still held a trace of smoke from nights by the stove. She placed her needlecase beside the herbs she would leave for Emma and paused over the beaded dress, the one a little girl had called pretty like stars. She could not carry everything. She could carry what would keep her moving. The desk held the ledger she had tamed into neat rows. She arranged it square, slid a pencil underneath and weighed it with a crock so figures would not drift. Beside the ledger lay Emma's drawing, a crooked house, a tall man, a small girl and a woman with a bright skirt. Abigail traced the child's name printed across the bottom, folded the paper along careful lines, and tucked it into the suitcase pocket as if it were a fragile map. The map hurt more than the suitcase handle. The hallway carried the faint rhythm of boots in the barn and the slower sound of wind beginning another argument with the eaves. She tied her hair, rolled her sleeves and set the room in order so absence would look like departure, not escape. Guilt moved through her like chilled water. She had chosen silence while measuring the truth inside Caleb's hidden note, hoping to bring clarity rather than cloud. Nathaniel had heard of secrecy anyway and called it proof. She could not blame him for guarding a wound that had already taken too much. She tucked the sewing tin into the case, left the herb jar on the shelf for soups that smelled like stories, and stood still until her breath slowed. Emma's fever had eased only days ago. Abigail would not add vanishing to that tender recovery. Yet the ache of the porch exchange pressed her toward the door. The lane led to the station. A room in town could be traded for mending and long hours. Footsteps entered the house. Not Nathaniel's stride, lighter, quicker, full of purpose even when early. Emma peered around the frame with hair wild and eyes serious. Abigail forced a smile because that had become her duty and her desire. Early bird, she said softly. I was about to make tea. Emma climbed onto the trunk and pressed a folded scrap into Abigail's hand. The paper smelled faintly of flour and smoke. The letters were large, uncertain, and brave. Stay, you're like my mommy. The child's chin wobbled, then set as if she had done a dangerous thing and would stand by. Abigail felt the sentence land with the weight of all the hours she had held a cool cloth against a burning brow. She sat, pulled Emma close, and breathed through the sting behind her eyes. Your mother loved wildflowers, she whispered. You told me she also loved you with her whole heart. I will never take her place. I can care anyway. Emma nodded fiercely and tucked her head under Abigail's chin, small hands fisted in the borrowed coat as if gravity had increased. Abigail looked toward the window where snow traced slow diagonals through the morning. A future hovered there, one she wanted, one she feared she might harm by staying while trust remained cracked. She eased the child back and kissed her forehead. I need to speak to your father, she said. He believes I kept a truth that could split a house. I wanted to be sure of it before setting it loose. Emma's eyes shone. Will you go? I do not know, Abigail answered honestly, because anything else would crumble. Ever felt torn between running and fighting for a home? Abigail's choice is coming. See what she decides. She tucked the note into her pocket where warmth might steady its plea, then led Emma to the kitchen for toast and honey. She made tea, sliced bread, and spread sweetness as if sweetness could hold the pieces that wanted to scatter. While Emma ate, Abigail returned to the room and tied the suitcase straps. She stood beside the bed and gripped the handle until blood left her knuckles. If Nathaniel had been able to hear last night, she would have unstitched every knot. Instead, he had turned away with the stance of a man who refuses to bleed where anyone can see. That choice did not make him unkind. It made him human. She would not punish humanity. She would guard her own, though it cost warmth in the small laugh Emma made when Tansy stole a mitt. The door to the yard opened. Nathaniel's boots left a scatter of snow across the boards. He carried a pail and the smell of hay. He stopped when he saw the case. Surprise lifted his chin, then tucked itself into the blankness. Grief keeps for emergency. His gaze flicked to the window, the bed, the coat, the quiet order she would leave behind. He turned as if to step backward into the barn rather than forward into speech. Pride moved him toward retreat. Emma stood on a chair so courage could reach his eyes. I wrote a note, she announced. I want her to stay. He did not ask for the paper. Abandonment had already written its cold counsel across his judgment. He set the pail down, removed his gloves, and said the sentence that meant refusal without cruelty. You do what you must, he murmured. I'll see you safely to town. Then he turned toward the hall, hiding a flinch. Abigail buttoned the coat, lifted the case, and paused. She slipped Emma's drawing from her pocket and unfolded it. The woman in the picture held hands without asking permission. The girl smiled with both eyes. The man faced them, hat cocked, mouth shy and hopeful. Abigail folded the paper so no faces bent, tucked it near the dress again, and whispered a promise to remember what it felt like to be wanted. She would not discard that wish even if she had to carry it alone. Behind her a small thump sounded. The note had slipped from her pocket when she hugged Emma and drifted under the table. Nathaniel returned for his gloves, saw the scrap, bent, and read the scrawled plea. The letters struck like a bell he had been deaf to since the fever broke. Emma had asked for presence, not perfection. The sentence cut through assumptions, through the hard logic of fear, through the habit of retreat that had protected him since a grave closed on a spring afternoon. He stood very still, as if any motion might scatter what the words were gathering inside his chest. In that stillness he saw the suitcase, the tidy bed, the ledger stacked square, the herb jar waiting for soups his daughter would request because they tasted like story, and he understood his mistake. He had guarded pain at the expense of trust. He had heard secrecy where he should have heard care wrestling with caution. He pictured Abigail on the station bench, veil catching snow, a freighter's sentence breaking a future she had sown by hand. He imagined her now stepping into another beginning because he had chosen distance over listening. He grabbed his coat, strode to the barn, and hauled the saddle across his horse's back in one practiced sweep. Leather creaked, the cinch tightened, the gelding tossed his head like a creature impatient with human delay. Nathaniel shoved his boots into the stirrups, swung up, and aimed toward the gate. Snow fell harder, clouding the yard, smudging landmarks, daring him to be swift. Determination set his jaw. He would find her at the lane, at the road, or at the station if it came to that. Love, Newly admitted, argued down the fear that had ruled him. He lifted the reins and rode into the whitening air while flakes thickened and the ranch blurred behind him. Snow thickened. He urged the gelding forward into the whitening road. The noon train groaned under winter's weight as it slid toward Bitter Creek Station. Bell clanging through the air, clear and bitter. Abigail stood by the far bench, with a ticket pressed between finger and thumb, the paper warmed by doubt and resolve. Snow sifted in slow lines, covering footprints as quickly as they formed. She had mended her courage like a hem and buttoned Nathaniel's loaned coat over the beaded dress, because leaving deserved dignity. Abigail set her suitcase near her boot, and looked once at the road, as if she could will a horse to appear by wanting it enough. She told herself that choice was better than drift. She would take a room above a shop, sew by lamplight, and make a life that owed nothing to any man's unsteady work. Abigail touched the crease and let go. She would not cry at a station twice. A whistle cut the quiet. Couplers jolted. Wheels complained. Wind slipped under her collar and found the places confidence had not yet learned to guard. She breathed until that trouble thinned. Then hoofbeats struck the road like a warning flung across distance. She did not turn at first. She turned when the sound grew fierce and sure, and the gelding burst through, falling white with Nathaniel bent low over the mane and Emma's scarf a pennant behind them. Nathaniel swung down before the horse halted. He set Emma on the platform and stood as if the world would not be in order until he said the thing he had come to say. His hair was salted with snow, and his breath smoked in rough cloud. Emma ran to Abigail, flung her arms wide, and caught her around the middle with a strength that made the ticket crackle. "You came," Abigail said, the words small because anything louder would break. "I should have come sooner," Nathaniel answered. He drew a small circle in the snow with his boot and lifted his gaze. "I was wrong. I let fear speak. I heard secrecy and called it betrayal. I forgot that care sometimes walks slowly because it is carrying something that matters." His hand opened. On his palm lay a simple ring, gold warmed by a pocket, bright as honey against the gray day. "Hannah's," he said, steady in the place where he had not been steady. "I kept it shut away because grief told me to lock every door. I brought it because I am done listening to fear. I am asking you to stay for me, Abigail. Not only for Emma. Not from duty, not because a ranch wants hands, but because my heart has found yours in my kitchen, at my ledger, and by my child's bed. I will make room for your history and your song. If you cannot forgive last night, I will keep asking until I earn it." Abigail looked at his face, and saw the effort it cost to lay pride on the platform boards. She looked at Emma, whose mittened fingers clasped both edges of her coat like a sailor holding the rope that kept a skiff from spinning away. "I meant to tell you everything," Abigail said. "I found a note hidden in my dress, written before I left Virginia. It said there was pressure and silence and talk not safe for ink. I needed to know whether it excused or merely explained before I spread it across your table like a sharp blade. I did not want Emma to learn that promises bruise without warning. I did not want to bruise you." Nathaniel closed his hand around the ring and then opened it again, as if practice could teach courage. "You are gentler than I had the right to expect," he said. "I can be braver than I have been." The whistle moaned. Steam feather. Abigail looked down at the ticket that had seemed inevitable when the house felt suddenly smaller than doubt. She looked up at the man who had ridden into the weather because a child had written a sentence that turned him toward hope. "What would you choose when love asks you to stay?" Abigail's answer is moments away. Keep going. She stepped to the window and slid the ticket under the grill. "Cancel if the rules allow," she said. "If they do not, keep it for someone who must run." The agent stamped the corner and nodded. "Storm's winning today," he muttered, but his eyes smiled. Abigail turned back with hands lighter than they had been in months. Nathaniel did not rush the ring. "Choose," he said simply. She held out her hand. He laid the band in her palm and waited. She slid it onto her finger herself. A pledge made without pressure. A seam meeting its mate because alignment had been earned stitch by stitch. Emma hopped, muffler flying, and clapped once. The platform no longer looked like an X. It looked like a small patch of earth with room enough for 3 hearts learning the same beat. Nathaniel exhaled a breath that fogged the world and cleared his face. "We should go home," he said, almost laughing at the relief in the word. "Home," Emma echoed, satisfied with the word as if it were a cookie still warm. Abigail picked up the suitcase, then set it down because Nathaniel had already taken the hand. He was careful without being careful for her, the difference she had prayed to find since the day she stepped from the train. They crossed the platform together. The train clanked and rolled, pulling past with a long tired sigh that sounded less like leaving than a blessing. Snow began to fall in slower flakes, large and unhurried, as if the sky had remembered kindness. At the wagon, Nathaniel tucked the case beneath the seat. Emma climbed up and reached back in the same motion to draw Abigail beside her. Nathaniel lifted her by the waist. Not claiming, not uncertain, simply sure. She settled close enough for warmth and left space where memory could rest without ruling. He swung up, gathered the reins, and looked to her not for permission but for partnership. She met his eyes and nodded. They moved through town as if the streets had grown quieter to let them pass. Doors shut softly, smoke lifted in careful threads. Snow softened rails and ruts. No one called out. Everyone seemed to understand that some choices do not need witnesses. The road rose. The world opened. The ranch appeared through a hush of falling white fence. Barn, the line of posts vanishing into a field, and the house that had learned 3 heartbeats. Nathaniel reined in at the bend so they could look. He handed the reins to Emma and dropped to the ground. He reached up both arms. Abigail let herself be gathered down, then lifted Emma after her. Wind folded and then eased. They stood in the lane without hurrying toward any door. Nathaniel set the suitcase down and drew his coat around all 3 of them. He kissed Abigail's forehead with a reverence that felt like a vow spoken without witnesses and therefore more binding. Emma tucked herself between them, smug and safe. Their breath rose and mingled. The sky lowered its voice. Snow fell more softly, as if the weather itself approved of a decision made without drama. Only truth. Abigail leaned into the circle they made and closed her eyes for a moment. She did not think of stations or rooms above shop. She thought of bread on storm days, ledgers in orderly rails, herbs waking in warm air, a song rescued from memory, and seeds tucked into fence corners for bees to argue over in spring. She thought of a child's drawing unfolded on a kitchen table and of a man who would learn where she kept her quiet and how to honor it. When she opened her eyes, Nathaniel was looking at her with a new steadiness. She smiled because the future had taken shape while they stood still. They turned together toward the porch, steps in time, Emma's boots squeaking in delighted protest. The yard blurred, then clarified, a blessing made of drift and breath. They moved as one. On the road, the gelding settled into a steady rhythm, and Emma narrated plans for paper flowers and biscuits, as if worry were a blizzard passing. Nathaniel promised to speak sooner, even when words were hard. Abigail promised to be frank, even when truth might shake a room. The ring flashed, certain, while wagon tracks braided behind them and the house waited, lighted. On the edge of the porch they paused only to laugh at Tansy's bark, then folded into an embrace that held warmth and promise, Emma between them, while the snow around the house softened into peace. Morning routines found a shape that felt earned rather than fragile. Abigail set primers by the window where light gathered, smoothed a page, and guided Emma's finger across letters that once looked like puzzle pieces scattered by the wind. The child sounded each curve and line, pausing to grin when meaning clicked, then whispering the word again as if testing a new bridge. Tansy sprawled by the stove, tail thumping when a syllable landed true. Nathaniel, passing with a pail or a sack of oats, slowed without thinking. The new curve of his mouth showed in his eyes long after he stepped back into the yard. Abigail's footsteps grew confident down the hall, steady on the porch, sure in the pantry. Her voice no longer hesitated at thresholds. She said plans out loud and watched the house learn them. Winter loosened its grip inch by inch. Drifts slumped, revealing the dark backs of furrows. Ice thinned on the creek until water wrinkled free and hurried toward bends that remembered trout. Meaty larks returned with bright notes that sounded like stitched sunlight. Nathaniel fixed a hinge on the porch, then watched meltwater glitter through ruts. He smiled more, not the careful look he once wore to avoid hope, but a natural expression that reached and stayed. When work allowed, he stood in the doorway and listened to Emma read, hands quiet, jaw unclenched, as if the room itself taught him a softer strength. Abigail and Emma planted wildflower seed in fence corners where bees would bicker come June. They tucked Hannah's saved packet into soft earth, with gentle hands and a whispered promise. In the kitchen, Abigail taught Emma to read recipes while measuring flour. The child spelled sugar with a giggle, then pronounced cinnamon with grave care as if the syllables might slip if handled roughly. Biscuits browned, soups simmered, herbs woke in steam, turning that stove into a small country where comfort made the rules. When the kettle sang, Abigail's laugh answered from the pantry like a bell finding its pair. Neighbors stopped by with winter tales, extra seed, spare hinges, questions about calves, and congratulations wrapped in talk about the weather. Word traveled slower than spring but faster than doubt. A porch that had once held sorrow now held coffee, warmth, and a dog determined to claim every laugh. If someone mentioned Caleb's confusion in town, Nathaniel glanced at Abigail, found her steady, and let the topic roll away like a sleigh after thaw. Trust had been rebuilt by work, confession, listening, and the daily practice of choosing the same table. Abigail's beaded dress, once a relic of a derailed future, found a gentler purpose. She unpicked a narrow row and edged a ribbon Emma wore during lessons. A quiet sparkle that honored patience rather than spectacle. The remaining bodice stayed folded in linen, not hidden, not displayed, proof that stitches can outlast storms and still catch light. Her hands developed a relaxed strength. She could lift a pail, coax a reluctant fire, mend a fence glove, sort accounts, and still keep a touch gentle enough to smooth a worried brow. House and yard began to carry her cadence. The land answered with its own sign. Snow retreated from the south side of the posts first, then from the bed nearest the porch where warmth collects. Mud replaced crunch under boots, robins auditioned on the rail, willow tips lifted green. The creek changed voice from muffled to bright. On the first clear afternoon, Emma read an entire page aloud while standing on the stool. Abigail had sanded smooth. Nathaniel clapped once, then twice, startled by his own enthusiasm. He scooped the child up, spun once, and set her down breathless, pride and relief mixing in his grin. Daily work knitted them tighter, branding, fence repair, checking calves at dusk, sharpening tools, turning soil, sweeping grit from the threshold. None of it felt like penance. All of it felt like belonging. After supper, with shadows long across the rug, Abigail practiced penmanship with Emma beside her, matching loops, crossing neat T's, minding the small space after period. Nathaniel traced both their names on scrap paper and tucked the sheet into his wallet with an embarrassed shrug that fooled nobody. He kept it there anyway, a talisman as practical as twine. Sometimes Abigail walked the lane and looked back at the room she had chosen. Smoke rose in a sure line, the bell by the door waited for weather or celebration. She pressed a palm to her ring as one checks a compass and found it pointing home every time. Her voice met Nathaniel's in the yard with easy greeting, teasing, planning, apologies offered and accepted before they hardened. On Sundays they sat near the back pew and shared a hymnal. She sang with quiet confidence, no tremor catching, and he found himself harmonizing without noticing when the notes lifted him. Spring rolled across the valley like a slow tide. Calves kicked, buds fattened, and wildflowers painted the ditches where stubble had looked like scars. Hannah's seed lifted first, near the gate, purple as twilight and brave as promise. Abigail touched a bloom and thanked the woman whose love still lived in small colors. Nathaniel saw and smiled with relief that remembrance could keep company without stealing breath. Together they learned how to hold past and future in the same hand while the present did the ordinary miracle of staying. Evenings returned to the stew. They sat under a sky that kept light longer each week, counting bats, naming constellations, and plotting a garden that might include corn if the creek behaved. Emma sounded out constellation slowly, then asked for a story about stars. Abigail obliged with a tale about a dress that remembered night and chose, finally, to be part of days. Nathaniel listened, eyes half closed, hands at rest, heart unafraid of being seen. The ranch breathed like a living thing, rooms warm, halls familiar, footsteps steady, voices certain, the whole place stitched together by small mercies repeated until they felt like truth. Trails dried, the road to town lost its rut. A new calf learned the fence line, then learned Emma's pockets held apple slices if approached with patience. The ledger stayed neat under Abigail's careful rails. Deliveries arrived on time, the bell on the porch rang for neighbors, not emergency. When wind rattled the eaves, Nathaniel checked the latch, then returned to the table instead of walking the yard until worry wore holes in his boots. He had learned another way to keep watch, sit still with the people who ease the dark. Snow melt ran laughing into the creek bed. Willows budded, cottonwoods showed a haze, and dirt under fingernails felt like a promise rather than a chore. The world was still rough, still wide, still full of work, yet hope no longer felt like a stranger asking at the door. It lived here now in Emma's careful vowels, in Abigail's calm instruction, in Nathaniel's unguarded grin, in the way the lamp pooled gold on their joined hands when stories ended and the house sighed itself to sleep. Love doesn't always arrive as planned, but it finds a way. Did Abigail and Nathaniel's story move you? Smash that hype button, share your thoughts below and subscribe to your brand for more tales of hearts braving the wild. What happens next will shock you.